Hi, welcome to the Great State Mural. This is Anto Murtaga, independent journalist based in Mongolia. I'm joined by my two co hosts. First, we have Julian Durkis, a self described Mongolist by choice and a scholar with a sociological perspective.
Hello, world, and hello, YouTube.
And joining us as well is Dörkan Alter, an independent researcher and a development professional.
Hi everyone, good to be here.
This is the Great State Mural, Mongolia Portrayed, half-hour podcast exploring the current state of social, political, and economic affairs in Mongolia, along with deeper insights and critical analysis issues shaping the country. In today's episode, we're diving into resignation of Prime Minister Oyun-Erdene, how it unfolded, what led to its turning point, and what it means to Mongolia's political future. To start off, I just want to ask you both. Maybe start with Delcan. Should Prime Minister Oyun have resigned at this moment, or should he have stayed on?
Mhm. I think you know my position already. So I think the short answer is yes, he should have resigned much earlier. And in fact, I'm wondering whether he should have been selected as a prime minister in the first place. And I'm also questioning the process, how he was selected based on which of his competencies, capacities, or like meritocracy principles in general in his selection. So I think we can talk about all of this. But so yeah, that's like one of the reasons why I think he should have resigned earlier. But another, I think, reason is just looking at just select any index, any statistics, any numbers that you would like to look at, and most of them would show you that there is a declining trend, kind of worsening of situation across key indicators in the country. I'm a sociologist also and have been involved in various social research. And just to say one very simple polling that result that was done by IRI and IRIN in 3 consecutive years that Oyun-Erdene was in power in 2021, 2022. We skipped 323 and now we have data for 2024. We asked respondents, like 2,000 people across the country. Would you say generally that our country is heading in the right direction or the wrong direction? The classical polling question, right? And guess what? In 2021 April, around 48%, less than half of the respondents said the country is heading in the wrong direction. And this is even after COVID 19 lockdowns, right? So already it's quite a low number. Then in 2024, the number rose to 60% of the people thinking we're heading to the wrong direction. And in between, in 2022, just after a year and a half he was in power, the polling already said that 58% are heading to the wrong direction. So it shows that this content has been very fast, just in the space of 1 year. Normally, we don't see such a sudden increase like that. Another interesting thing related to this episode is the corruption issue, and we see that um, corruption is seen as the worst problem, and the government is least able to handle this situation. So this was already a shared understanding among the population. And plus, it was seen as the third most important problem facing the country after employment and economic situation. So this was the ground and the background. So imagine how this scandal and new events might have triggered public discontent to quickly provide background for mobilization and further events.
What is your perspective, Julian?
Very interesting, right? public discontent, the survey data is obviously quite convincing and impressive. Yet, in the election last year, Mongolians re-elected the government. Yeah, reduced majority, but basically they re-elected the government. So, if even though in surveys people might voice their discontent, apparently they were not so discontented that they wanted a new government. Obviously, there's always people who don't vote for a particular government who may be very unhappy, and but they're, that's not how elections work. So it's interesting that discontent has risen, as Togan has said, but I wonder whether any of nothing's going to change with this government, right? A new prime minister next week isn't going to make any difference to that piece. There'll be a new person, and maybe there'll be a more popular person. Although I don't, my sense is Oyun-Erdene hasn't been particularly personally unpopular. So that level of discontent is unlikely to change. And so I'm not sure that I see level of discontent as a reason for resignation very clearly. Now, I obviously say this as a non-voter, unlike the two of you. So I'm not going to tell anyone what they should or should not do in any case because I didn't vote for them. Um, but that, that's a question I would raise, is even if unpopular, if the root of the unpopularity was really the person in this case, and I think probably a little less so, and if it was discontent with government policies, well, that gets very tricky because no one else is offering alternative policies, including the two other parties in the coalition. And if it was discontent with what, government in general, some version of that, well, then nothing's going to change, and then people should have voted differently. The corruption piece is an interesting as well, right? Is an interesting element. Maybe Anand, you can tell listeners a bit more about what's actually been happening for the last 2 weeks with the protests. But I would just notice that when some people have now written, at least in the international press, about how this resignation was brought about by corruption, I would sort of probably argue with that to say the proximate cause, the immediate cause right now may have been these protests, but that's probably not why he was forced out. Because if you think about the coal theft case, the much larger protests 2.5 years ago, and a much more significant corruption concern than his son's girlfriend's Chanel bag, which is unfortunate, but I'm not too concerned around in the grand scheme of things. And so I think this corruption piece, the protests are the proximate cause, but not really the cause of what's going on. But do you want to tell us a little bit about how those protests have unfolded and your sense of them, Anat, because you're on the ground?
Sure. The the protests of from looking at it from the other protests that have happened organically, like let's say the 2020 protests when it happened after the last speaker said that we should buckle our belts and things are going to get rough. A lot of young people came to the streets, and that was a very organic protest. They had that protest had more numbers, but it did not last long. It it kind of fizzled out. I think some of the leaders or the people who were there, or like the leaders of the protests, they did talk to to the government people, but nothing really substantive happened. And the last election for the coal theft, they also did speak uh, with the current speaker, and it also was kind of not really sustained well, I would say. But this protest, on the other hand, it seemed to have a better organization. The younger people had more a cohesiveness. They knew what they wanted. They demanded the things they had. I think they had like three three things they demanded. I think I can't. What one was, I think, the resignation or the disclosure of the finances. Second was to what was it? I keep forgetting. But the third was that not having a presidential system. So there was like three things, like three demands that they have put, and they were very consistent. They were very consistent, even though their numbers were not as high as the previous protests. It was very consistent for 22 days. They protested. They gathered people. It was very peaceful. They've they made a lot of things. Uh, they will organize things on what to say, and also what kind of information that they would give to the people who came to the protest, which was v- very good. And there was also some backlash towards the protesters. I would say is that some people thought that this is not good. I had that sense of, as personally myself, that seeing um, I, I saw, like, from the previous governments we had, that our governments did not last long. It was like mainly like 1 or 2 years long, and this government lasted longer. And I think that that sustainability is, even if there's like corrupt people in our government, like if things are just stable, I think it's kind of good in my sense. Maybe I'm wrong. Do you think that it's wrong that we have like a long running government that can sustain things? Because the previous governments, they didn't last long. It was just like in the 90s, there was just what was it, like, some governments were like almost like few months even.
Yes. Yes, I think this is a very fundamental question we've been grappling with in Mongolia for the last 20, 30 years. For the sake of stability or for the sake of change and um, instability, basically. But I think it really goes down to how we define stability. Is this one government sitting in one position without changing consecutively? I don't think so. I think stability means, just based on my personal understanding, a government that consistently pursues its policies with support from its own other political parties, and with at least some legitimacy from the people, and based on trust that they have ground to be able to continue such policies. Stability, in the sense of just people not changing, forced upon whilst the public or the other stakeholders don't have any confidence in government. Despite that, forcing and continuing to trying to really persist is not stability, in my opinion. So it's much better to change in that sense. And what I observed with Oyun-Erdene's government specifically, since he got in power in prime minister's position in 2021, interestingly, the number of youth protests have increased, unlike in previous years. Um, do you remember the Do Your Work movement, No Nadam? And they were each quite big. So I think Julian earlier mentioned the election piece, the corruption piece, and I think we should really talk about the youth piece, the youth factor in all of this unfolding of interesting, unexpected turns, how the election uh, re- results showed that re-election of MPP, the corruption scandal hasn't resonated previously that much with youth, but this time it really resonated, maybe because it's involving other young people right into their face. And it's something. And just preceding that, there was the case of Narok, the independent media that was attacked by the government, which really signaled that yes, the young people here, their voices being crushed. So I think the issue of youth factors were interesting. And yeah, maybe Julian, what do you think about this youth factor and how the youth, in your opinion, view stability?
Oh, that is a patently unfair question. I'm much too old to speak about young people. I will have to leave that to you entirely. um, I mean, it's right. The we have seen over the past 15 years or so, right? We've seen waves of youth engagement in various forms, not just in the formal political process, but also in protests, obviously, right? And so I think it's very interesting these questions you raise about what sort of issues might produce greater mobilization. And I think the connection you made with the early arrest this year, where right not only the generally those kinds of media, but that particular group of people was very much focused on uh, a, an element of change and of youthfulness and the like. And I wonder whether one of the real successes of this particular moment wasn't actually also that it was young people, as you mentioned, involved with the prime minister's son's girlfriend, presumably. But that conspicuous consumption that she displayed and that really got all this started is, in some ways, is also consumption that is a bit more closer to youth, right? Because we see
Yeah,
a
it
lot of
is.
fancy cars, right? We see a lot of
Yeah,
giant cars driving around Ulaanbaatar, and people aren't, surprisingly to me at least, aren't so much offended at the giant cars, but somehow the Chanel bag offended people more, and it seems to have offended youth in particular. And so clearly, there's an element to this is what sort of issues resonate and how they can also be effectively portrayed in a demonstration. But the odd thing that I want bounce back to you is, and it's relevant, I think, to some of the emerging discussions around who might be appointed next. I mean, Oyun-Erdene, in some ways, within the party, was a youth movement, right? He came in as the first of the '80s politicians. Now, that's a decade younger than me. So to me, that's young people. They're barely kids. But that's not exactly youth, although, of course, we know that sort of legally youth in Mongolia is defined until age 35. But right, this was when he came in, this was supposed to be a youthful political movement. And now we see a lot of discussion, seem to in the last couple of days at least, of a return to the '70s generation, perhaps. What do you make of that? That this, right, that the 4 years ago, or even before, even when he became cabinet secretary, he was associated with a demographic change and a generational turnover. And yet, I think I agree with both of you that what we've seen in these protests is a youthfulness. And so, how do you resolve that? I don't know if it's a contradiction, but that difference in perspective or in perception.
I think the yeah, the perception is at play. I would say that even though yes, he is from the faction of like members from his party that are youthful from the '80s, but they did not really portray themselves as the youth generation. I would say, and they don't really like they talk about it within themselves maybe, but they don't really like show it to the public. I would say, and even if they do show that to the public, they don't really like practice that in a sense. Like maybe like let's say for like what we have in America when Barack Obama got elected, he showed himself as a person who understands the youth, who uses what the younger generations are using, like Twitter at the time. But I think this this faction or like this group of young politicians from the Mongolian People's Party, they did not really portray that well enough that they are the younger generation. They more or less coalesced into the old guard imagery in my sense. That's what I had. And from jumping on that point is that I think I just remembered that the second demand they had was that the second demand the protesters had was to break this coalition up. They didn't want this grand coalition. They wanted an opposition party within government. Do you guys think that maybe like having this grand coalition also hurt Oyuriden's prospects of running this government even longer?
Uh, yeah, I was exactly thinking about that. In addition to the youth corruption election, this coalition government came as a surprise for many of the voters, especially those who voted for the Democratic Party and other smaller parties. And the fact that the Home Party and as well, so the fact that the coalition government was established gave a signal to many people, including the youth, that yes, they're, and in addition to the fact that the government paid way too much attention to public relations, doing like reels and promotional videos and very staged engagements with public. There was rarely an open, honest, direct contact between the prime minister, his cabinet, and the people. So really, there was already that long,
Mm,
big distance where people could not really access the prime minister and his real face. On top of that, the coalition government that kind of gave signal that he's maybe consolidating power and really silencing and buying off where he can different parties or opposition and silencing where he can through police protests, etc. Others and really using different instruments to silence different parts of the society. So I think this coalition government really was a bad kind of move on his side. I think he thought the opposite. This will secure him long-term guarantee, and he can control the parliament through that coalition. But in fact, it was the opposite, in my opinion.
mhm. Your quick take on this, and then let's jump to the second topic, Julian.
Well, this is if this is going to be our first episode, we're going to have about 3 listeners, and they're all going to be enthusiastic and encourage us to go on. And so I hereby give you an outlook on the next 250 episodes, where in almost every episode I will be returning to the theme of if only parties in Mongolia had an ideological profile, things would be much better. And that I see that in this conversation around the coalition, in that we really can't, I at least can't distinguish between either individual politicians, or the parties in terms of what they're going to do. And it feeds into the current situation because I don't think anything's going to change because there's no actor out there who really has a particularly different view of how to proceed. But the piece I would add to the coalitions is that it's just very unclear, I think, why this coalition even got started, right? The census, and I think Dogan gave us a little bit of that in a moment, is that the government, the MPP, thought that they were consolidating power because they could get rid of an opposition by including the opposition, even though obviously they didn't have to. And then DP and Hun both let themselves be bought off, right? They were handed jobs, and so said, okay, we'll be quiet. None of the rationale for that coalition has changed, right? The rationale would still be the same for the MPP, and presumably it's still the same for the opposition or the coalition partners. And so I don't think anything in that regard is going to change either. And I do find it a little bit odd when that protests demand the breakup of a coalition. Yeah, that's a little hard for me to understand because that's what they voted and that's the political reality and that's what's happened. They'll have their chance in 3 years to vote for someone else, and then maybe next time they want to vote for other people. But this idea of, oh, don't be a coalition, I think I agree that voters may have been surprised by the coalition, although there were plenty of whispers about it beforehand, right? That some kind of coalition might be likely. But really, my ongoing frustration is where's the substance in any of this, right?
I
And
think I
and
think that I think the rationale behind the coalition was to uh, just to get things rolling, get the ball rolling really quickly. Like if you have a grand coalition, you can just do things quickly without any kind of hampering, without any kind of like st- like gesturing, like finger pointing, like, hey, what are you guys doing? I think they were just trying to avoid that, just get things done quickly. I think that was
but
probably the
Anand, what are
rationale.
they getting done? The 14 mega projects? You gotta be kidding, right? That's what? That's not something to get. I agree with what you're saying, and that's how it was presented. Right? Let's get things done. But these projects,
Yeah.
really?
So I think I see that you're coming back to election. Just one point is that this election was very interesting in the sense that it was very generational. I would say there was a big gap and difference in how people voted. And those groups, 18 to 35, were the group that voted the least. I think the presentation was very low. I think, Anna, you can quote the actual number. The group that was active is, of course, the older people. So the young people who are protesting at the square, they didn't vote. At least one third of them did not vote. So that's one thing to consider. The second thing is that um, when the sorry, over to you, Anna.
Can I push back on it? I think actually young people voted in large numbers. It just looks low in proportion to the to the overall population of young people. I think the number was actually even higher to the demographic of what was like 65 till 70.
Yeah,
But yeah,
that's
it's right that young
mhm.
people did not really vote in large numbers, but looking at other groups, they voted fairly well. And compared to other countries, it seemed more higher in
Yeah,
Mongolia.
compared to other countries, yes, but in Mongolia, within their age group, in terms of representation, it was quite low, as usual. But this time, particularly low, if I remember correctly. But let's double check on that. But the second point is the very interestingly, Julian, you say that if people want to change, why did they vote for NPP again? I think that's a very good question. And I was there during the election year in Mongolia as well. And the general feeling was that most people had kind of like a feeling that they gave up, that any change will happen, that any new party and can be elected even, because there was a feeling that the election was going so unfairly, there was not enough competition and playing field basically for candidates. So even the fact that the Democratic Party was able to secure like at least 30% of the seats itself showed came to a surprise for many, and it's a pleasant surprise actually. So the expectation was very low. Of course, hope is high, and we wish things were different, but we knew NPP was doing almost everything in their capacity to gain the majority. But people still showed resilience and voted in high number the two other parties. So that was kind of the maybe the other side of the election story.
Okay, moving from election, jumping back to the original topic, why do you guys think that Prime Minister Oyun-Erdene brought the confidence vote to Parliament? Do you think he had a backing from his own party or from the other two junior parties?
I think governments have in other countries as well used confidence votes at times to force parties to either agree and support and thus be quiet maybe, or make a decision. And I think that's what he was doing here, right? If I'm right that the real reason he got pushed out, I mean, never mind that formally it was a resignation, but let's talk about it as him being pushed out, right? If the real reason were underlying issues and fact most likely factional politics, then the demanding this vote or asking for this vote was his attempt to say, okay, either you support me and I go on and then be quiet, or make it public and kick me out. And so that's how I see that there was a gamble. The same thing is happening in Poland now, right after the presidential election, that presumably Prime Minister Tusk is asking for a vote of confidence to say to his coalition, okay, either you're with me still now with a president from the other party, or you're not, and then we need to move on. And that was probably something like Oyunyan's question here. You see that, William?
Yes, but the party, before the confidence vote even happened, they decided on that Ayurtin should resign. But suddenly something happened in the backgrounds. Maybe he had a change of heart, and then he suddenly brought it to the confidence vote. Why? Why is that?
I think that was the only kind of way out potentially for him to from that situation and remain in his position. I think the calculation he made is that yes, within his party there are of course some who support him, and as Julia mentioned, the factional politics, but some who will oppose him and who will demand his resignation. But how I think the fact that he brought it to voting from the other parties at the parliament, including DP and Hum Party, based on the calculation that given that they are already in government, perhaps some people within Democratic Party will vote in his favor. So that way he can secure at least some majority. So I think this time he didn't rely on his own political party comrades, let's say, but he was relying on others. But the fact that Democratic Party decided altogether to not participate in this voting, I think was something unexpected for him. And that, I think, was a very important factor in how the outcome of the vote. So I think it was a bit of miscalculation from his side.
Yeah, I think it's relatively open at this point, what all the parties are going to do. And there's a couple different scenarios. Like I mentioned before, I think I thought the whole coalition idea was a bit implausible to begin with because the MPP doesn't really need it. But now what we saw in this ouster of the prime minister, I think one of the elements that we saw is that factional politics within the party seem to have gotten stronger again because we did see a division. And I think Jürgen is right that the DP was fairly unified, but we did see MPP divisions here. And so what that's one of the things I'm asking myself is and now that we've seen over the last couple of days that the process isn't going quite as fast as we thought in terms of a new nominee, maybe that's partly what's going on in some divisions within the party. And so that makes me wonder about what will happen within the next government. And then the question that you both also raised is what does this mean for Hun? Um, I haven't really thought about the two other small parties, whether it means anything for them or not. Maybe they're mobilizable. Um, I think the DP. It seems like maybe this was not entirely unwelcome to them. That perhaps they are a bit more unified and have found more of an oppositional calling, possibly. But those are sort of the dynamics I think we'll see play out. We'll know a bit about that in terms of once we see a prime minister, who it is, and what the cabinet actually looks like. Um, and then we'll find out what some of the substantive changes may or may not be. I'm not expecting many, but maybe there will be some.
Okay, with that, we have to wrap up this show. Now we end our segment with what we're calling Megan Words or Megan Takes. Wise words in English, I would say. Any kind of take that you found interesting trivia, or any kind of takes about this episode. Um, let's start with you, Julian, and we'll go around for Delgon and me.
I am increasingly uninterested in personnel permutations, and who the person in charge is interests me relatively little. And I think we spend much too much time regarding Mongolian politics thinking about the people and whatever coalitions they may be in. And I've seen that for the past 20 years. I'm interested in outcomes and policies. And I think in terms of outcomes and policies, this resignation of the prime minister will turn out to be a total non-event, and that government policies will not change greatly.
Mhm. For me, the key takeaway was first of all, never underestimate youth. They can mobilize, and it did give some hope. Of course, people might say it's a bit naive or like the youth cannot change anything. But no, we have to remember in 1990s, who were the main agents of change at the time? It was the youth. So we should always listen and, if possible, expand that youth voice beyond those who are just in the city center and those who have access, but yeah, a bit broader in the whole country.
Okay, my my take is that persistence bring a lot of change. It can bring change, I would say. That's what I saw from the protest. They were very persistent, and which I liked. And th- I saw a lot of protests in the past, and most of the time they were fizzled out. And in the beginning, there was so much hope and just so much energized movement. But afterwards, the second day, the third day, the numbers dwindled. The fourth day, there was nobody. But for this protest, it was even though they had smaller numbers, even though they couldn't protest for long periods of time, they were persistent, very persistent. They were well organized, and I think persistence is the key. That is my American take. And with that, we end our show. That brings us to the end of this episode of the Great State Mural, Mongolia Portrayed. As Mongolia enters a new chapter of political change, we'll be watching closely and bringing you the context, questions, and conversations that matter. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share with your friends and family, and leave us a review. Thank you. Bye.